Calaroga Shark Media.
The Lucille Ball Comedy Festival kicks off tonight. Hello, I'm Johnny Mac with your daily comedy news. My guest on today's program is Journey Gunderson. Journey is the executive director of the National Comedy Center, the United States official cultural institution dedicated to comedy as designated by the U.S. Congress. That is pretty cool. As you will listen here, the museum is super impressive. Their approach to some things, specifically, we'll talk about it in the interview, the areas of comedy that get a little wonky, you know, somebody says something or somebody does something in the real world, and then you look at their body of work and you're like, they are handling that well. I don't want to spoil the interview. The National Comedy Center is in Jamestown, New York. Why? It's Lucille Ball's hometown. Lucy wanted Jamestown to celebrate up-and-coming artists, and that is part of the 34th Lucille Ball Comedy Festival. Tonight at the festival, Nicole Byer, 7 o'clock. By the way, 7 o'clock, not 8 o'clock. This old man, love it. Imagine I could go see Nicole Byer, and we're done by 9:01. I'm back in the hotel room, half asleep by 9:30. That sounds amazing. But there's also comedy late night comics from around the nation who have appeared on Conan, America's Got Talent, The Late Late Show, Late Night with Seth Meyers, Last Comic Standing, and more will be performing their newest and sometimes bluest material. The event takes place in Ricky Ricardo's nightclub. What a cool venue, right? So let's jump in the pool. Here's my guest, Journey Gunderson. Maybe you can help me. This is a topic that's been coming up on the show. When we talk about comedy, especially on my program, we tend to talk through a lens of stand-up comedy, but branching out the form, where do we start talking about it? I could argue for Shakespeare. I could argue for Bob Hope. Jimmy Carr made a wonderful argument that Richard Pryor and George Carlin are like the John the Baptist of the modern stand-up comedy, bringing it out of the clubs into the arenas. So for you, obviously, Lucy, part of this, where do we start?
I'm maybe because I'm a museum person and we have created the first official archive, I tend to go further back in my milestones. You know, when people go through the stand-up comedy lounge exhibit, you know, they're seeing Gene Carroll, and they're learning about Frank Fay, and it's, Moms Mabley. So I tend to focus less on when they filled bigger venues and more focus on the art form and the craft and what they contributed that might have been unique before maybe it was even called stand-up. And in terms of sketch and other genres, you know, we've got original vaudeville era scripts from the Marx Brothers with their hand annotations on them. And so we go back as far as we can.
I know one of the things at the museum that I'd love for you to talk about rather than me and try to explain it, not having seen it, is the Comedy Continuum. I just found this fascinating as we tie together the history of it and it influences. If you could just walk the listeners through that, please.
Sure. So the Comedy Continuum, it's my favorite exhibit. It was the hardest one to build and bring to life. It's like the game 6 Degrees of Separation or 6 Degrees of Kevin Bacon on steroids in comedy. It's this massive 70 or 80 foot wide, actually radar interactive wall. And you're building a web of connections that you continue to expose and build of collaborations in comedy. These are connections based on people who have worked together that you might otherwise not realize have worked together, or connections of influence. And what's neat is that not only are you uncovering these early in career collaborations between people who often end up as huge solo names in their own right, you're making connections between other visitors, right? So we see like a father and a son, or a grandfather and his grandson, and one has uncovered like Trevor Noah in political comedy, and then it connects with Mort Saul, and they're having a moment together of realizing that maybe their taste and sense of humor isn't that different. And guess what? Those who do political comedy now stood on the shoulders of those who came before them.
It's interesting to me. I was prepping for this and listening to you on some other interviews. You mentioned, or the interviewer mentioned, how quickly some comedians not get forgotten, but just time marches on. Over the weekend, I was listening to Joe Rogan, and he name-checked Richard Jeni, and he name-checked Robert Schimmel. And when I first got into this working at SiriusXM, I knew Schimmel pretty well. He was at the top, and I don't think I've really heard Robert's name. For those who don't know, Robert passed away. It's probably 15, maybe 20 years now. But, you know, here's a comedian that was at the top, and just for whatever reason in the zeitgeist, those names don't come up as often. So it's great what you guys are doing.
Thank you for saying that. And I couldn't agree with you more. And I admit that what, I guess annoy is a strong word, but what annoys me day in, day out is how often you hear people commenting that, oh, the new style in comedy or new voices in comedy are so much more vulnerable, or they're talking about their issues with mental illness, et cetera, and they're so much more candid. I don't see that much. I mean, certainly there was an era where no one talked about that, but when Richard Lewis passed away, what better reminder do we need that there have been decades of people willing to be vulnerable and pull back the curtain on neuroses, than that. And so there are these heroes. I guess what that puts a finer point on is that there are heroes of this art form that are sadly so quickly glossed over by the TikTok generation, and things move so fast now that the saddest example, this is really a downer thing to say, but we tour sometimes high school groups through, and I wasn't shocked when only a smattering of hands went up who knew George Carlin or why they should care, because they're 17 and 18 years old. And so we're, introducing them to his brain in comedy. We do a deep dive with his joke notes, and you see process of one of the most prolific comedic minds the world will ever know. But Robin Williams is now a name that when young, like seniors in high school come through, they aren't familiar. And if that doesn't speak to the need for a museum and a cultural institution like this one to put, quote unquote, these paintings on the wall for the next generation to be educated about, I don't know what does. These are heroes, and they deserve to be memorialized for generations to come.
I teach a college class about radio, and I remember, and even this story is maybe 10 years old. I remember mocking through how a morning show team works, and whatever example I was using, I said, and that would be an example where somebody could throw in a JFK impression. They had no idea what I meant by a JFK impression. So then I tried to bring it forward, and I said, Mayor Quimby from The Simpsons, and they still had no idea of the reference. I remember another time I was talking about late night, and I said Carson, and they thought I meant Mr. Daly. And it just, and I know I'm up here on Old Man Mountain now, but the time goes by. Back to the estates. I think it's great that you're working with the estates. In the course of my career, I've worked with the Hope people. I've worked with Jeff Satzing with Carson. I know Kelly Carlin fairly well. And I think those are three estates in particular that are in good hands, where it's not about money. It's about keeping the legacy alive and getting the name out there. So again, kudos to you and the museum on keeping those names out there. George Carlin in particular, I get it. How would you know George Carlin unless he showed up on TikTok? Although specific to Carlin, his last two albums, which I didn't love at the time, quite honestly, and thought at the time, has George lost his fastball? He just sounds so angry now. When I play his last two albums in 2024, topically, they sound like they could have been recorded this morning. I know every time there's something in the news, somebody dusts something off, usually from those albums.
Yeah, it's like wine. Sometimes it's better with age, or these brilliant, prolific minds are sometimes ahead of their time, right? So it is interesting to look back on comedy from different eras, because actually, as W. Kamau Bell, who's an advisory board member of ours, said, he gave a speech at the grand opening, and comedy is so temporal, right? It's so of the moment that there's a lot to be learned. In addition to just appreciating the humor and having good laughs, there's so much to be learned from observing what was funny and what was a punchline at an exact point in time in our culture. And so when people come to the National Comedy Center, they're not just enjoying themselves and laughing at a really well done curation and examination of comedy's greatest hits and heritage. They're also given the opportunity to learn about truth tellers from every era.
How do you handle things that have fallen out of fashion, whether it is Amos and Andy or Flip Wilson or something more recently? Is there a tendency to go, let's park this exhibit for a while? Is it out there with an explainer?
It's funny because it just depends on what sometimes makes it onto the internet or goes viral in the wrong way, because like Bill Hicks is a good example. I was recently listening to an old, I think it was early 90s era Bill Hicks album. And there's some stuff in there that wouldn't hold up now in terms of homophobic, type of commentary. And I think it is so common. And as artists have said before, I'm saying it now, everyone evolves. We all evolve. And I don't think anybody stands by every word they've ever said and, insists that it was perfect. But there's something to be learned even in that. We have a blue room level of the museum for this reason, right? We didn't build a blue room level, which is leaning into the most boundary pushing material of all time in different eras. We didn't build it to endorse it and say, like, these things are fine to say. We built it because we're a museum, and that's the conversation that we're trying to have, is look at what was okay to say when, or look at how controversial it was when Lenny Bruce was making jokes about the Catholic Church and being arrested for it, or making jokes about the government and being hauled off stage and having to spend the night in jail. That's why we feature it. And so whether it's a Dave Chappelle joke that's considered transphobic, that's also in the Blue Room, or Louis C.K.'s material in our lens on the topic of too soon. There's an exhibit on the concept of too soon. And when is it okay to joke about tragedies through all of these different stories and lenses? And we tell this story through the lens of 9/11 and the aftermath and comedy that came out. And so there's Gilbert Gottfried, who I toured through this exhibit, and he's an example of it not going well, right? At the Hugh Hefner roast, making a 9/11 joke in what many considered in the room too soon. And someone even called that out. But Louis C.K.'s material, on 9/11 is in that exhibit. You asked, how do we handle controversial subject matter? Because we didn't approach the whole story of comedy as one of glorification of individuals anyway, when we designed the museum, it was really about the art and the contribution and the craft and the substance of it, the work product. We didn't suffer too badly. It wasn't, Cosby was on trial when we were in the throes of media production, getting ready to open. And because we didn't build a Cosby wing, it was okay, because we didn't omit the Cosby Show from the exhibit on television comedy, because you can't tell the story of comedy on television without it. And again, it's really about the work and the subject matter that comes out of, this process.
I love that approach. There's some articles, and maybe it's, I don't know, maybe it's cool, maybe it's a little lazy. I'll see your museum compared to Cooperstown. And for me, I often, when I have baseball arguments, I'll say, you cannot tell the story of baseball without Barry Bonds. I'm sorry. He should be in the Hall of Fame. I won't make you litigate somebody else's museum today, but I love your approach of, you can't tell the story without the Cosby Show. The Cosby Show happened. That's a thing. Comparing it to baseball, in the Baseball Hall of Fame, if I go out and hit 85 home runs, they still make me wait 5 years after I retire before I get in. In terms of an exhibit, especially here in the 20s, we see shooting stars in comedy. Somebody will get super hot on TikTok. Again, we're both here to celebrate comedy. But there's a guy who's selling a lot of tickets right now who doesn't have the 30 years. Doesn't mean that he's not good at comedy. But do I have to wait to get an exhibit, or can I just, if the UFO lands today and I slam the bid on Wednesday, can I be in the museum next week?
That's such a great question. And our feeling on that is that, and it's often said, museums should stay respectfully one step behind the art form. So it is often only with the benefit of hindsight that anything can be properly evaluated. So we try not to expend valuable, precious resources, we're a nonprofit, to jump to celebrate or build an exhibit about the latest, as you said, shooting star in comedy, unless there's a story there to tell, right? Like a story of comedy might be how during the pandemic, a lot of lay people, I'll say, would say like, oh, well, can't you just do comedy on Zoom? And people who perform comedy understand that the audience, the relationship between the artist and the audience is actually crucial, and that energy and the acoustics of the laugh and the timing of that and how that can work and not work in different mediums. And so moving to drive-ins and performing to cars, like that's a story. And so really we're about telling the meaningful stories of the craft and the art form more than or picking the stars that are worthy. I'd rather focus on what was contributed and why it was unique.
Let me come at it from a different angle. It's a Thursday afternoon in the summer. We're all looking forward to Summer Friday. It's late in the day. Bob Newhart has passed away. Do we immediately react and see what we have in the back room and put it on display? Or how do you handle something like that?
That is true. We do go into the archives and see what we have, and we start to reflect, as everyone does in hearing the news. And we ask ourselves, okay, what unique ground on which did he stand? So is it, one thing I would say about Newhart is he was known for that deadpan delivery. And so you can see the influence in so many that came thereafter. He was also able to succeed. Like, one of my favorite things about Newhart is that he won Grammys for Album of the Year, including Album of the Year, going against like Frank Sinatra and Harry Belafonte. And so here's comedy beating rock stars. And that makes me smile because, this was early on. And so he had to go toe to toe and beat them out for Album of the Year. He was also notably a great talk show guest. Not all comedians are great guests, and he was fantastic on Carson. So we have some of that in the museum in our Johnny Carson exhibit. Then you go over to the television comedy exhibit, and there he is in a piece about workplace comedy. And as we reflect, again, we step back and say, like, what is the unique ground? I think he will also go down as having the distinction of sticking the landing as well as anyone can in a series finale. Television series finales are difficult, and he nailed it. And I love that goes down in history as one of the greatest of all time.
It's amazing that he's the one who had the #1 album because of his persona. If you had told me Dice Clay was the first to do it when there was Dice Mania, if you told me Dane Cook did it early this century, okay, I would have believed it. But Bob Newhart, the salesman, the low-key deadpan guy beating out Elvis is just amazing.
Yeah, that's like one of my favorite stories of comedians as quote unquote rock stars for once, because you're right. The vibe was not such. And Dice Clay is a great example in contrast.
All right, we'll head towards a break here. The National Comedy Center, Jamestown, New York, was named Best New Museum in the Country by USA Today. It is one of Time Magazine's World's Greatest Places, one of People Magazine's 100 Reasons to Love America, and one of the 25 Best Family Weekend Getaways by U.S. News and World Report. Just 3 blocks away, the Lucille Ball Desi Arnaz Museum celebrates the lives, careers, and legacy of the first couple of comedy, the impact they had on the world, and also the story of Desilu Studios, which not only produced Lucy stuff, but produced the original Mission Impossible, and most importantly, Star Trek. I wish Desilu still controlled Star Trek. Don't get me on a Star Trek rant. Don't do it. Did you see the Section 31 trailer? Did you see they're making a Star Trek sitcom? I obviously like comedy. Don't make a Star Trek sitcom. All right. Be right back. So the reason I invited you on today is because it is the Lucille Ball Comedy Festival kicking off. Again, kudos to the museum. This is something that's been around for quite a while, but I think the museum has brought more daylight to it. It has definitely been on my radar the last few years. So what can we expect to see this weekend? Who's coming? What should we do? Encourage people. I've talked about this in the past. If you drew a circle from, I don't know, Cleveland to Boston, New York, you can get there. And it's a really pretty part of the country for people who aren't familiar with it. So why should we come up this weekend?
Because now a trip to Jamestown, New York, it's like an immersion by day, you're immersed in an award-winning museum experience where you are given the chance to really appreciate generations of artists. And then in the evening, take in the best live voices in comedy. And I just can't think of a better way to spend a weekend. And it's funny because museums contextualize. That's what we do. We provide some context so things can be appreciated. We aren't just showing clips and saying, isn't this funny? And so I think that what is unique about attending the Lucille Ball Comedy Festival relative to other festivals is because you're in the setting of the National Official Archive and the museum, it contextualizes the comedy you're going to see that evening live on stage and just engenders in the audiences an even greater appreciation for what these people are doing. I love that it's come full circle that Nate Bargatze is headlining a sold-out arena show. And my first festival was really when we got the festival back to being a comedy festival and less of a nostalgia, I Love Lucy reflection. It originated as a comedy festival with a young Ellen DeGeneres, a young Ray Romano, Bob Newhart, in fact, the Smothers Brothers, George Wallace. And that was Lucille Ball's intention for her hometown. and that it become a destination for the celebration of the art form in all of these ways. And then, like any strong brand, whether it's Elvis or Star Trek, the fan community of I Love Lucy and Lucille Ball is so massive that dominated for a while. And it was actually the estate, you mentioned the estates, the estate raised its hand and said it was supposed to be more broad than this. It was supposed to be about all comedy. And so 2011, the 100th birthday of Lucille Ball, that anniversary year, was really the first year that we set forth saying we're building the National Comedy Center, the first National Archive and Museum. And the festival will get back to its roots about being, entirely about comedy. And Nate Bargatze was the first comedian ever booked, and he was in our showcase, then largely unknown. And now here he is hosting SNL, starring in one of the most viral sketches in SNL history on the brink of its 50-year anniversary and, headlining our festival in the arena. So there are dozens of other amazing comedians coming to town. I like to say that you can, experience what you can otherwise only experience in the greatest, most legendary clubs coast to coast by coming to Jamestown that weekend. We have Ophira Eisenberg, Dave Hill, Aaron Jackson, Matt Koff, who's an Emmy-winning writer for The Daily Show, Nina Daniels, Ali Makovsky, and more.
Specific to Nate, I don't know what you nailed it. And here's why I'm saying this. And I don't mean this about look how cool I am. When the initial releases came out about the festival, there was a line, I'm paraphrasing quite, and another headliner to be announced. You hadn't yet announced Nate. And I mentioned on the pod, for some reason, the universe was telling me it was going to be Nate. I had no inside knowledge. There was nothing. I didn't read an article telegraphing it. I just said, it just felt like it was going to be Nate. And then when it was Nate, I was like, ooh, look at that. The universe somehow communicated that to me. I think you guys have done a great job. You spend a lot of time around comedians. I've spent a lot of time around comedians. Sometimes it's not all sunshine and roses, and there's jealousy. Or I've talked about on the podcast of the New York City brick wall cigarette smoking crowd will give the LA people a hard time. Now there's the Austin contingent. Everybody's mad at the blue collar people. You've worked with Foxworthy. He's the nicest guy in the world. You know that Larry the Cable Guy. And I'll tell this to Larry because I'm friends with him. Larry's the nicest guy in the world unless Jeff Foxworthy's in the room, right? I mean, these are just wonderful people. So kudos to you that the comedians seem to be backing this thing. Like my sense is, you're able to ask people to come and they come for whatever reasons. People are motivated to come, but you're getting people. They're not giving you no's. And the artists seem to genuinely love this thing, whether you're involved with somebody like Lewis Black. So that just speaks volumes about the work you're doing. Thank you so much for saying that. Yeah, I often lay awake at night in the 10 years building it going, oh, this was a really bad idea. Like, the comedy community doesn't ever take kindly to outsiders telling its story, because in comedy, authenticity is paramount, right? Through and through. And you just cited, the cynicism, and to build a museum, an institution for the most anti-establishment population of people who are really good at making fun of things. I was like, oh, maybe this is daunting and probably a bad idea. And so one of the things that we don't tout often, but some people have noticed in the museum, is that there is no third party voice. Media pieces, all of the storytelling is in the voices of artists and creators and craftspeople themselves, directors, producers, stand-ups. So we relied really heavily on getting the story right by talking to and interviewing hundreds of comedians so that we didn't make the mistake of being this third-party institutionalized voice telling comedy story for it. And I think it's funny too, because comedians wouldn't have built it for themselves. They have a complex relationship with awards and award systems, right? That's why like the American Comedy Awards, I suspect, has come and gone and never found its sure footing. And so comedy becomes the redheaded stepchild of the Oscars, for example, the Academy Awards. And so I think that's maybe why there was a void for so long of an institution that exists to celebrate it. And I'm glad that the toughest crowd, which is comedians themselves, have loved it every time they've toured. Like, I love when you see a John Mulaney on his tiptoes peering into Rodney Dangerfield's leather monogrammed duffel bag that has like his actual jokes and joke notes
stuffed into it that he would carry on the road with him as a briefcase, because they didn't have iPhones. Nothing was digital. I love seeing comics laugh at Joan Rivers' typewritten sheet of paper she carried in her little briefcase on the road, 17 ways to handle a heckler. It wasn't a bit. It was like those were her 17 ways she was ready with. These were her working papers. And I'm really excited that starting in 2025, we're going to be able to get really creative about showcasing and making an exhibit of the 65,000 typewritten joke notes, joke cards of Joan Rivers that span from the 1950s through 2014. It's like this amazing history of comedy through one perspective.
I believe it. Now I wish I had picked up some scraps of paper 20 years ago. I produced Joan Rivers' radio show for a few years, circa 2001. And she would work openly with two writers, an older guy and a younger guy. And they would they would scribble down a punchline and hand it to her. And I mean this very respectfully. She may not even have realized what the reference meant, but they would hand her a piece of paper. She would read it, get the laugh, deliver it, timing, everything about it, and then throw the piece of paper on the floor. And they were just feeding her lines left and right. It was just amazing to watch, just a pro's pro.
Yeah, it's funny. I mentioned Dangerfield's notes, and what stands out to me is every single centimeter of the sheets of paper is filled with handwriting of his in 3 or 4 different utensils, ink, lead, everything. And they're dog-eared and they're wrinkled because he used them for so long. And in the upper left-hand corner, it says, "What a crowd, parenthesis 2X." Like he wrote down that when he took the stage, he was going to say, "What a crowd, what a crowd." And that was in the upper left-hand corner of that little sheet of paper. And so because good comedy looks easy, I think the layperson or the casual consumer of it doesn't have a great level of respect for what goes into it. They go to an art museum and see an incredible painting and they go, "Oh my God," like how they can't even imagine. But the equivalent in comedy is the 1,000 hours on stage, the iterative honing that goes on, and no one appreciates that it's down to every syllable and the emphasis on each part of a word that can sink or make a joke. And that's part of what we try to do in the participatory wing. We didn't build a participatory wing because people are good at it. Like quite the opposite. We built it because it shows visitors, for example, in comedy karaoke, we could give you a teleprompter with the strongest stand-up bits of all time and you'll bomb because you don't have the delivery, and it teaches them the difference between, or the layers of the onion, right? Like it's the writing has to be good, but the delivery and the timing and every part of it is so much a part of the sauce. And that was our compass in building the entire museum, was pull back the curtain on how hard this is and that there's a level of precision and that it really is an art and a science.
I want to circle back to something you said a few minutes ago about not having a third party person tell the story. That speaks to me. I had the privilege of working with the Pythons for their 40th anniversary. We put together Monty Python Radio for Sirius XM. And one of the creative decisions that my team and I made was every piece of audio had to come from the Pythons. So the liners were by the Pythons themselves, but the soundscape, all the quirky noises were all from episodes of the TV series. They had granted us a waiver for the weekend to make the radio station. And it all came out of the Python universe, which made the project sing in a way that using generic rock liner number 4 and a DJ voice going Monty Python Radio would have just been lame. Having Eric Idle tell a story about John Cleese, that's what made it sing. So again, I think everything you're doing is just absolutely on point. I have tremendous props for you. I mean, I'm a guy recording a podcast in the basement. Who cares? But as a fan, awesome job. So let me ask you, sometimes I burn out on comedy. I do this most of the day, and I explain to the listeners, then 10 p.m. comes and like, I don't want to watch the latest YouTube special. I just want to watch something. I'll watch The Universe and just let somebody tell me about Saturn's rings just to turn my brain off. So what do you do when you're not doing this? And follow-up question, if we come up to Jamestown, other than all the comedy events, what else should we do? Where do we eat? Where do we hang out?
Okay, so the first question, my struggle is just having anywhere near adequate time to catch the latest special or late night show, because in a nice way, like someone once said, managing success is harder than managing failure. And so like I said, there was such a void for so long of an institution doing this work that now the floodgates have opened. Once people got to Jamestown and realized this was the place and that it wasn't going anywhere and that this was for real, the amount of archives there are to preserve, the amount of estates we're working with day in, day out. We're presenting Nate Bargatze in an arena one night, or, inviting Jeff Ross to town. But on the other arm, we're preserving Don Rickles' archives and working with his estate. And so some of them aren't public yet. And so I don't want to speak out of turn or accidentally do a press release via this podcast, but just insert the next dozen names you can think of whose comedy archives you would like to see preserved. And we're talking with them now. So it's funny. It's ironic, I guess you could say, to have very few hours left in the day for our staff to actually now say, okay, we've got to be consuming what's new. The pantheon of comedy is pretty large. When you're going back to the Marx Brothers and then trying to have your finger on the pulse of today, it's like, it's endless. But it's a nice thing to be buried in.
It's the Lucille Ball Comedy Festival kicking off tonight through the 4th. Thank you so much for your time. This was fantastic. I am definitely going to hit you up next time a topic comes up to see if you can come on again. I've got a million more questions about the museum, and I do need to make it up there. So thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you for having me. It's been great talking with you because you are a guy who is so steeped in comedy.
Let me give you a little behind the scenes there. So during her last answer, the internet was getting a little wonky. Now, the system I use, it records locally. So if I'm interviewing you, it's recording my files on my computer, your files on your computer. And then at the end, we both upload to the central core, whatever it is. That way, we both have a clean copy. So I didn't want to interrupt her and be like, oh, I can't hear you, because I knew she was giving a thorough answer. I just couldn't hear it. I'm sharing that with you because you may have noticed I didn't ask a follow-up about some of the estates and some of the legacy coming up. I'm very curious about it, but that's why I didn't follow up there, because I couldn't really hear her. After she finished speaking, I took a full time out and we kind of fixed stuff, and then I tacked on that close there. So that's what went on there. That's why I didn't follow up there. Just thought I'd share with you. I will wildly speculate. Richard Pryor would make a lot of sense. Bob Newhart would make a lot of sense. And Richard Lewis came up during the interview, so maybe those are clues. Who knows? Wild speculation. Here's what's scary, too. The folks at the National Comedy Center, some of them listen to this podcast. That's a lot of pressure. I'm just a dude in the basement. Kind of cool, though. Journey Gunderson, thank you for coming on the show. Best of luck with the Lucille Ball Comedy Festival this weekend. Back with a normal episode tomorrow. See you then.